record on this computer. I think we are recording. So
It says it's recording.
cool. So this is official. This is official business, man. Um,
Okay.
Getting recorded. So just all I don't necessarily have an agenda for this time. Um, I loved what I was hearing from you guys with Mercy Hill, and then figuring out you guys were a church plant. I just think that's a really unique place to lead, and it hasn't been very long. I mean, that's a pretty short amount of time to go from
Yeah.
30 people being sent out from the Summit Church all the way to this 4 campuses, multi-site. And so I would love to just kind of talk about that. I would love to hear, and not, I know you already shared kind of before we started, but if you want to share just a little bit again, just about how you kind of got connected with them and how you ended up at Mercy Hill.
Yeah. So about, I guess it was 8 years ago, 8-ish years ago, my wife and I were, we had recently just moved back to the area from Las Vegas, actually, where we were working at a church. And man, I was looking for a church. I was looking for a job at the same time. And we were checking out a couple different churches. I was sort of gig leading worship at a couple of churches. And, one week I came to lead worship at the church, and the guy was like, "Hey, man, just wanted to let you know we have a guest pastor today. He's actually a church planner, and he's coming from the Summit in Raleigh, which is J.D. Greer's church." And I'm like, "Super cool, man. Who's J.D. Greer?" And but he came, and I watched Andrew, who's our lead pastor. I watched him preach and listened to him preach that day. And I went home and I told my wife, I was like, "Hey," I was like, "this church is coming. There's like 30 of them coming from Raleigh with young families. This is the life stage we're at. We're looking for community." I said, "This sounds like something we should just be a part of. Let's go check it out." And so we did. We joined. I was telling you before, we went to one of the pre-launch meetings and kind of felt super out of place because this was all of the launch team. They were sort of like in like serve mode and like, we're the army. And here I am, I'm like a consumer. I'm just like here to check it out. But I was like being handed like, "Hey, here's stuff you're going to need for when we have launch Sunday." And I'm just like, what are we here for? But anyways, yeah. So then we went to we went to the launch, and I will say that's the cool thing about a church plant, man, is that like we right out of the gate we were sort of treated like an army. We weren't just treated like consumers, like in a good way. I mean, we were respected and all of that stuff, but like we felt super welcome. But we also felt like right away we were like, "Hey, we're here to serve. Like we're here to like bring signs of the kingdom. Like let's go and let's jump on." And so. Yeah, man, our first Sunday was that launch 2012 in September, and just been there ever since. And we're 4 campuses big now. It's kind of hard to tell exactly how many we're running because it's COVID season. So, just like who's even at our church anymore. But yeah, man, it's been a wild ride, but it's been awesome.
Yeah, man, I love that. Love hearing your story. Can you tell a little bit about what it was like coming on staff at a church plant? And so did you start, that's a question, did you start full-time staff, or were you kind of bivocational, or how did that work?
Yeah, so like I said, I was looking for a job, and I went to lunch with Andrew, the lead pastor, and I said, "Hey, man," I said, "I'm just gonna be honest with you. I want to be on staff. I want to like be the worship leader." They were looking for one; they didn't have one, and he just kind of told me like point blank. He's like, "Man, I'd love for you to lead worship with us, but I probably can't pay you anything." And I was just kind of like, "Oh man, that is not what I wanted to hear." Like I was looking for a job. I mean, let's face it. And but I think what he did, man, was really valuable because he wanted to know that I was gonna be there because I wanted to be there, and he wasn't quite ready to hand the keys over to a stranger. But man, about 2 weeks later, or 2 months later, he was like, "Hey, why don't you lead a couple of weeks in November? Just kind of see how it goes." He'd never seen me lead, so I led, and he took me to lunch again and was just like, "Hey, listen." He's like, "Man, we just think that last week when you led, it was just like one of the best, one of the sweetest times of worship we've had. Why don't you just keep doing it indefinitely?" So I was doing it kind of like on an honorarium base,
Yeah.
for like 2 years. I worked a full-time job. I had 4 kids. I was working like 55, 60 hours a week. And I only did it because I loved it. To be honest, it was challenging at times, but we got through it, and I think 2015 was around the time that I finally came on full time, and yeah, man, it's just been
That's great. No, yeah, that's great, man.
yeah.
So during that time, what did the team look like when you got there in terms of volunteers, worship team, tech team? How did you see it grow over those few years when before you were full time staff? And then what does that look like to this day? Like, how have you seen it grow? And then tell me maybe even a little bit about when you guys started launching campuses. But what did the team look like when you started, and how have you seen that team change and grow over the last few years?
Yeah. So when we first started, it was mainly my wife plays piano. Um,
Great.
I play acoustic and sing. So there was some weeks where that was it, man. We just kind of did it. And then there was two other vocalists there who sang like harmony vocals. I had a drummer, I had a bass player, and then sometimes we'd have an electric player, and sometimes we wouldn't have any of those things. So um, they used pretty much they started with like having a cajon, and they would bring in like guest worship leaders from the Summit Church
Yeah.
before I started, and then after, I guess kind of what I inherited was just like half of a band. And so man, people would come up to us every once in a while and just be like, hey, I play this instrument or I play that instrument. And so I would just be like, hey, come to practice. No audition needed, we need you, so just come and practice. And of course, that's not, I would not recommend that model, but it worked. I mean, it worked for us. And we had different challenges. I mean, there was times where we would have a full band planned and then something would fall through. So then we kind of like got on board with like the whole like, well, hey, if we start playing with multi-tracks, then we could sort of fill in the gaps, and fake everybody out, right? And we did that for a while, but ultimately we just tried to be creative with it. If we didn't have a drummer, we'd do an acoustic set. Um, and honestly, I think the bigger challenge was that was like I felt like I had to have control. I felt like I was the only one who could lead because I knew that I could lead, and I knew I needed to raise up leaders, but I didn't really know how to do that without me just literally stepping down and letting somebody else take my spot. And honestly, that's kind of how I had to do it the first time. I led every single week for like 2 years. I mean, even when my wife had twins on like a Friday, I was there on Sunday morning just leading, and it was crazy, man. One night I had it was actually like right after Christmas time because we had a staff Christmas party, and I got laryngitis. Like I felt it coming on at that party, and I was like I would go to talk and only air would come out, and so I had a background vocalist, and I finally was just like, "Hey, dude, I know it's Saturday night, but I need you to lead for me tomorrow. I have zero voice." And so he stepped up and he just killed it, man. And then I just realized I was like, every challenge would be because we would sort of plateau, and what we would need to sort of raise our capacity. We'd need to be able to just sort of like create space to let new people, you know, lead and play who maybe weren't going to be quite on par, where we wanted them to be, but knowing that they could get to that point. And man, almost every single time they would rise up to it. So those were the challenges. It was always like at first just like, man, is it okay that we're going to be putting somebody new in? And of course we've learned and grown in how we do that now. Now we have like a almost kind of like a little farm system where we can do that that's not on a Sunday service, but um, yeah, man, it's been cool to see it just take off and honestly be surpassed. It's humbling to be surpassed by so many amazing, incredible worship leaders and musicians, but it's really cool to be part of something like that too.
Dude, that's so good, man. I love hearing you talk about raising up leaders. I have a couple follow-up questions from that. One, especially in this season, you said it earlier, we're in COVID season. It's a weird time. I know for me, I've lost on my volunteer team from a variety of reasons. I've lost a drummer, a bass player, a keys
Mm.
player, an acoustic guitar player, two electric players, some singers. Like I've like turned over an entire band and a half. And there have been some weeks where we've had to go, you know what, we're doing an acoustic set. And we're a little bit more of an established. My campus of our church is 14 years old, so it's not super old, but it's not super new either. We have some great musicians. But if there's a worship leader watching this who's like, man, I really don't want to do an acoustic set, do you have any encouragement that acoustic sets aren't lesser? It's actually an opportunity, like you said, to be creative and lead your people through.
Absolutely. Man, I was of the same mindset too that an acoustic set was somehow less of an experience. And what really inspired me was I went to a Phil Wickham worship night where he did his acoustic sing-alongs.
Yeah.
Now, we're not all Phil Wickhams, of course, so that's Phil Wickham is Phil Wickham. But I went to that and I was just like, it was him, his acoustic guitar, and he made that thing just sound like a band. And it was so, I don't know that I've ever experienced a night of worship like that before or since, because it was just so incredible. And it wasn't just about the fact that he could destroy his guitar playing or sing, like a limitless range. It wasn't just that. It was like he was just such a good worship leader. He could take you on this journey, and he would get you there and connect the words of this song to scripture to your heart and put you right there on that journey. And man, something as vulnerable and simple as an acoustic guitar, honestly, you can't achieve certain things with an acoustic set that you would do with a full band. There's certain things. So I think, as long as you embrace the strengths of an acoustic set, you can do everything that you would want to accomplish in terms of leading a full band set. I mean, I've seen people lead, I'm sure you have to lead acoustic sets in a massive venue like a Coliseum, and it works. It just works. And so, yeah, man, if you can be creative with what you have, you don't have to make your band look like the band at the church next door. It's use what you've got and capitalize on their strengths. Absolutely.
Yeah, man. I heard Bob Kauflin say this recently in a podcast I was listening to, that so often we can treat music like a second mediator, like Jesus isn't enough. So an acoustic set's not enough because Jesus isn't enough. Therefore, we need a full band to actually get us into the presence of God.
Right.
That's not the case. That's not the gospel. Jesus is enough. You don't need any instruments. Praise God, we have them, and the Lord uses them. But if all you have is an acoustic guitar and one voice, or no voice, and you got a backup singer with a voice, like that's enough to meet with God, because Jesus has made a way for us to meet with God through the person. And so I think that's so good, man. I also want to follow up and ask, you were kind of talking, you kind of have like a process now for building up, training more leaders. Can you just tell us a little bit about what that looks like for your church?
Yeah, I mean, man, everything from onboarding new people with like an audition process all the way to like trying to raise up leaders to send out. We talked about church planning and how integral that is to who we are as a church. And like, we are a church planning church, and that's just, we literally say like, man, we exist to like raise up leaders and to send them out to make disciples and multiply churches is our church's mission statement. So in every ministry for us, it's like, man, we're not just trying to get people onto the team. We're getting people onto the team and immediately getting those people to turn around and raise someone up behind them. And so our process looks like, we call it, so, a lot of churches have kind of like an onboarding, like an audition process. And then there's kind of like a training period. We call that essentials. I know, like Church of the Highlands is a massive church, and they're like church of 30,000. I think they call theirs Cultivate. And so for us, it's just like, man, we want people who have the raw talent, they've already auditioned. We want them to be able to have all of the tools and just have a really good runway so that when they get to Sunday, they're not asking really any questions. They're just like, man, I've already done this. Yep. So we have, it's like after Thursday night band practice for us, we have all of the people who have auditioned who have not yet officially made it onto the team. They come together, they form a band, and then I utilize our existing team members as coaches. Right. And they raise up people. And so we've been developing, it's just a leadership pipeline. I mean, that's what it is, man. We have, team members, and then we have coaches, and then we have kind of the next step after that. And it's really just like a set of tools that we're trying to move people along. It's very, very systematic, it's very organized. And it's like, man, we have teaching modules and trainings, everything for, we kind of have like main categories for each level. So like, theology, discipleship, musicianship and artistry, leadership, and we want to give people this set of tools and then be able to raise up somebody else while they're working to the next level. And the ultimate goal of that is to get people who are like, hey, they could literally lead a worship ministry as a worship director, so that when we're ready to have another church plant, we could just be like, hey, go with this church plant, go with them. That's what we're trying to do, man. That is totally what we're all about.
Yeah, that's so good. Do y'all have any kind of like residency program or anything like that as well?
Yep,
Or is that
we do. So we've always had like a church planting residency for like the lead church planter. Something that's really cool that we've actually partnered with Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and we've partnered with them, and so we actually just started like a seminary program where it's like you actually get a master's degree for going through it. And so mainly right now it's just people going through the class for like church planting as like a lead planner. But we've been in the works of like adding a worship wing to that as well for a while. So we've not had anybody go through the official residency, for that per se at this point. But man, we're like in the process. I'd say we're probably 70 to 80% there.
cool?
So yeah, man, it's funny because just about every month, I mean, that's not even an exaggeration. I probably get a lead pastor or a worship pastor, somebody who will be, somebody in the area who will send me an email or a text and be like, hey man, we're trying to hire somebody, we're trying to hire a worship leader or a worship pastor. You got anybody? And same thing with like our new church plants. Whenever we're sending people out, the lead planner will always be like, hey man, who do you got that we could take with us as a worship leader? And man, I say this with total shame, but I would always go to the very bottom of my pipeline and be like, okay, who have we poured the least amount of resources into, the least amount of time? Because listen, I've got my worship staff, I've got my systems, I've got my people. So like people who are talented, maybe they're in a good life stage to go, they're younger, they're ready to go, but like I haven't invested too much in them. And I would ask them, and without fail, every single time they'd be like, no, I'm not ready to go. I can't, I've never even been thinking about that. And my missions director and I went to lunch and we talked, and he was just like, he's like, man, maybe if we raised people up and thought about it, flip that on its head and be like, who is at the very top? And he told me, he's like, man, you should be the first one to consider yourself to go every time we're getting ready to launch somebody, launch a new work. So that kind of, man, that just flipped everything on its head for me. And I was just like, man, we've got to be raising people up to send.
Yeah,
So yeah, man, that's totally our heart for sure.
dude, that's good. I love to hear that. Follow up to that, when you guys plant churches, I know you're a multi-site church, you have multiple campuses. Um, are y'all primarily planting new campuses of your church or autonomous churches or both?
Yeah, both. Man, we want to do both. So right now, like the last two church plants, we've helped to plant 11 autonomous church plants, not counting campuses.
Right.
The last two of those were totally like in-house. Like we sent our church planner. He went through as an apprentice for our community groups, and then he led a community group, and then he went through our residency, and then we sent him to Tampa, Florida to plant a church with like, I don't remember, I think it's 20-ish people
Yeah.
that we sent. And then the last one was Roanoke, and same thing. The lead planner was actually part of our launch team from the summit here. So that's really a really cool full circle. But yeah, man.
Very cool. Tell me a little bit about your city. I'm just thinking if someone's listening to this and they're like, man, I'm in a smaller town, or are you in a big city somewhere? Or are you in a suburb? Like, what's your city like?
Yeah. So we are our main campus, broadcast campus is in Greensboro, which is, so the whole Piedmont Triad, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, High Point, is like somewhere around 1 million, I think. And honestly, that number is probably pretty outdated. I feel like every day it's just growing so much because it's massive. But Greensboro is the gate city. It's got Interstate 40 just goes right through it, and so that was kind of a big reason why our lead planner decided on this location, honestly, because he knew we wanted to be ascending church. So Greensboro, Winston-Salem are both pretty big cities. I live kind of I live in Winston-Salem. I live kind of like right in between the two, though, in a suburb. So we have campuses and kind of in both, honestly. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome, man. If you were giving advice to a young worship leader who's thinking about taking on a new role and going, man, I don't have a team, what's your advice for them on how they're to develop a team when they get
Yeah. If I had one thing, um, I would always be on the lookout, shoulder tapping people. Just getting to know. Man, that's so hard. You put me in such a small little box to say one thing,
there?
because I feel like you as a worship pastor. I mean, maybe this one thing might be different, pointing people to God's word and pointing people to just like really love the Lord in that way. But like in terms of growing a team,
Yeah.
I would say like yeah, being on the lookout for new leaders and knowing that nobody is ever going to. You probably can relate to this. You're not going to meet a Phil Wickham or somebody who is like that caliber of worship leader is not going to walk in your door. You're gonna see like a young, underdeveloped. I've heard Christian Stanfield tell his story before, how he was just like this kid on the worship team, and he was sort of apprenticing, Chris Tomlin, and it's like nobody would have ever thought back then that Christian Stanfield would be Christian Stanfield, who he is now. And just being able to have vision, being able to like go in knowing that like, man, there's going to be people who come through your ministry who have so much potential. They just need guidance, they need direction, they need to be equipped, and then they need an opportunity to be empowered to actually lead. And sometimes we're just like, man, I got nobody, like so and so, yeah, they can noodle on a guitar, but it's like they're not there yet. But maybe it's just a little bit of investing, a little bit of encouraging, pointing them to the right resources, and having some vision, having some patience. But yeah, man, I guess if you could sum all of that into one thing, it would just be like, you know, be on the lookout for raising up new people, and having patience and balancing that with like just trusting, like, man, they'll get there.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Well, that's super good. Now I want to shift the conversation just a little bit with seeing where you started, how you've grown the team. How has theology been a part of your leadership? What's the role of theology in your personal worship leader? I've heard different people talk about this. I was in a conversation once where I heard someone say like, hey man, when you're hiring a head worship leader, you're not hiring a theologian. And I was like, actually, you kind of are. And so,
Yeah.
what's your take on that? I know we didn't even talk about this before, so this could be a hot take. What's your take on theology in the worship leader?
Yeah, man, you're right. It's so important. I mean, whether or not your internally your church organization sees it this way, the church sees the lead pastor and then they see the worship leader, and sort of in that order. And man, the pastor, whatever church you're at, I mean, they're going to have anywhere from 30 to 40 to maybe, if you got John Piper talking, maybe 50 minutes, and somebody, they're going to have that much influence. Well, a worship leader is going to have like 20, 30 minutes influence, again, depending what church you're at. And that's a lot of influence for them to be given over without any kind of training. So, I mean, you asked the importance about theology. I mean, theology is truth. It's about how we view God and how people view God. And I think that that is kind of paramount. It's really important. Everything from picking songs to what you say in between the songs, and honestly just anything and everything in between that. So yeah, it's important. I don't think that you have to have somebody who is a necessarily a theologian, like, man, they've got their master's in divinity, in theology, in order to lead worship. But I think that the amount of reign that you're willing to give them should depend on that trust and knowing what their knowledge of theology is. I definitely think that. So, there's people who are younger on our worship team, and maybe every once in a while, maybe they're leading and they're just getting started, and they'll say something and it's kind of like, well, that was a little bit of a heresy you just said, and every once in a while, like when that happens, we're not going to be like, oh my gosh, we have to make a public apology to the church. It's like, man, that happens. It's okay. People understand. But if people are sort of driving at the same heretical nail, it's like, okay, hey, let me pull you aside. I could remember a time when Andrew pulled me aside, and I was using an illustration about rain in the Bible, and I was using it, of course, in the context of the passage. It was talking about God was blessing the people by sending rain for their crops and their harvest, and I was using it as like, it rains on everybody. It's like a bad thing, and I was just completely taking it out of context. And I remember, Andrew just kind of pulled me aside and he's like, hey man, like, it's okay, but I just want you to, like, it's okay that happened, but I just want you to understand theologically that, like, this is actually what this means. And it was a moment like that got me to think, you know what, I should be doing a little bit more diligent in the theology end of things, because it was important enough for the pastor to pull me aside in between services, and it absolutely is, and so that was helpful for me, and even just to see the importance of it, and of course, with time, you're going to be able to develop your own, like, calls to worship and your own worship leading style, and you're going to use verses and you're going to say different things, and that just shapes the way that people view God and how they view their life from the perspective of, like, how does it relate with the gospel and all of that. So it's just so important, man, all of it.
Yeah, I love that. We do a pre-service worship and prayer time before both of our Sunday morning services. And in order to help train up other leaders, I have a couple of interns that I've started giving over that. And so it's like, hey, you're going to lead worship and lead the prayer time for our worship team. We always say we want to be worshipers before we're worship leaders.
Mm-hmm.
We actually take time to worship in the secret places before we worship in the public spaces, like in front of everybody. And giving that over to my interns, man, it's awesome to see them grow in their leadership, and but also you also hear them in their prayer times, or maybe in their call to worship for that moment before they sing the song. You hear some stuff, man, where you got to follow up and go like, man, dude, the Holy Spirit didn't die on the cross. Like, you can't say that. You're getting your verses of the Trinity mixed up, and it's just funny. We were all there at one point. I can think of a few moments where I said some really silly things into a microphone on stage because I was young. I was 21, leading worship, and man, I've only been following Jesus for like 6 months, and I didn't have a clue what I was doing. And, anyways, man, that's good stuff. If you had just one parting thought, maybe a couple of thoughts for young worship leaders, or maybe guys who've been leading for years, but they just feel like they're in a rut in their leadership, what would you say, especially in this season where I think burnout is at an all-time high right now with COVID? What's some encouragement that you'd want to leave with someone who might be listening to this?
Yeah, man, I would say get an accountability partner of some sort, a mentor, a peer, anybody, somebody, and set some goals. Somebody you can process through, somebody you can, read scripture. Honestly, I have a friend of mine, he lives in Charlotte, and one of the most valuable aspects of my personal walk is that he and I guess, mutually consider each other like accountability partners. And man, on my own, I could get sort of, I could think inwardly, and I could just kind of get in a rut where, like you're talking about, spiritually, emotionally, really in anything. But if I've got somebody who I check in with on a regular basis, and I'm just like, hey man, can you hold me accountable to these things? And help me to think about these things, and somebody who you trust, who could speak truth into you, man, there's nothing that can compare to that. Nothing. So I think it's so valuable.
So good. Well, man, thanks again for your time. Why don't you share, just as we close, a little bit more about your church, how we can follow, like if someone wants to follow you on Instagram or social media, and about the worship music that you guys put out.
Yeah. So Mercy Hill Church, or I think it's Mercy Hill. Gosh, I don't even know. You put me on the spot with the Instagram thing. I think it's Mercy Hill NC now. It used to be GSO, is our church's page. But man, like most churches right now, we're putting everything online. which has been a cool, sort of byproduct of this season is to get to see what other churches are doing, churches that maybe weren't even putting their stuff out before. So, man, we're putting sermons out. We're putting our worship services out. If you want to follow us on Instagram for our worship page, it's Mercy Hill Worship. And we recently just released our full length album, 12 songs, and that's on there. It's on Spotify, Apple Music, all of the places. And yeah, man, check that out. And man, I want to thank you. Really appreciate you for. I came across the Spirit and Truth page, and I was like, "What is this?" Because I'm actually just working through some of the training stuff we were talking about, and getting to that point about like writing some things down about like what does it mean to worship in spirit and truth. So when I saw that, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And I started reading some of the posts that were on there. I was like, man, this is solid stuff. This is really, really good and really helpful for anybody, whether you're a brand new worship leader or you are just like a Christian that's not in worship ministry at all. Some of this stuff, man, is super helpful. So I wanted to thank you for that. And thanks for having me on, man.
Yeah, dude. Thanks for being on here. I'm thankful. I'm at a really great church that really encourages those kind of things. We even have a position paper on our church's website about spirit-led worship that our elders put together. And I mean, so it's really cool to be a part of churches that value those things, and other worship leaders, meeting guys like you who care, are like-minded, equally yoked in the things of leading worship and theology and the spirit. And so, man, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll, stay connected and we'll do this again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks, man.